also be available. He'll also be available for questions and answers at the end. And the other person I want to acknowledge is Pete Comet, recently retired as Tumwater mayor. And Pete has been a cheerleader and a driving force behind preserving the old brew house. And so Pete's going to be here hopefully to answer some questions if you have any about the current status of the brew house and the whole site down there, and maybe about what the future might be. So let's finally get started here. The earliest history of the Olympia Brewing Company is pretty well documented. It started, of course, as the Capital Brewing Company in 1896. It was started by Leopold Schmidt, and he wanted the brewery to be as he called it, a dainty brewery. And just a hobby for him, really. Other people were supposed to build it and run it. But once it got up and running, he stayed pretty involved, other than the fact that he also had all of his 5 sons involved. The brewery got started and brewed great beer based on the artesian water in the area, and it grew fast. So he and his sons were almost continually adding new buildings or expanding on old ones. So let's talk about how the brewery site got from here, which is a view from about 1910, to here, which is an air photo taken just a few years ago. What happened to the brewery site from the year 1916 to the year 1964? And why are we concentrating on those years today? Because that's when the brewery was not involved with beer making. It's kind of a forgotten period in the brewery's history, and what has been written about those years contains some misinformation. So we'll try to clear up those pieces of misinformation as we go along. So here's a brief overview of what happened to the brewery through the non-beer years. We'll talk about each of these uses in more detail as we go on. The site was used by the brewery for making beer from 1896 to 1916. Then after Prohibition, it segued into fruit juice production for a few years. And then a paper mill took over and made some big changes in the site. And then after sitting idle for more than a decade during the Depression, a metal goods manufacturer refurbished the site until finally the whole site was reacquired by the brewery in 1964. And in all of these different uses, the Schmidt family had their fingers in the pie in some way, sometimes small way, sometimes pretty big way. So let's get into some details here. As I mentioned, the brewery ran the site from 1896 to 1916. In brewery parlance, this was known as pre-prohibition, or just pre-pro for short, as opposed to post-prohibition or after 1933. Washington State voted in prohibition in late 1914, earlier than most of the rest of the country, and we finally went dry on January 1st, 1916. You'll also hear the date of going dry on December 31st, 1915. So we're talking about that moment in time at midnight on December 31st, 1915. So I'm not going to start with the very earliest buildings on the brewery site, because most of those will show up on the maps as we go along. This is a Sanborn fire insurance map. And in case you haven't heard about Sanborn fire insurance maps, they're a great resource for historians and researchers. Sanborn was a national company that from around 1867 mapped cities and towns all across the country in regard to buildings that might require fire insurance. So they were interested in mapping the composition of the buildings. Were they stone or concrete or brick or things that were relatively fireproof? Or were they wood, which required fire insurance? A town had to be of a certain size to get mapped. They weren't going to come by and map every tiny little town in the US, but they mapped some of the major towns, most of major towns, and they remapped them as time went by when the town had grown enough where there were a lot of new buildings appearing, so that information had to be added. So Olympia was big enough to get mapped by Sanborn Fire Insurance Company. Tumwater wasn't, but Tumwater had the biggest industry in the area, which was the brewery. And so Sanborn went ahead and mapped the brewery. And this is what they mapped in 1908, which was the first time that the brewery appeared on a Sanborn map. So Sanborn maps used a color code to call out the construction materials used for each building. And this has helped us out a lot in trying to figure out when these buildings appeared and when they disappeared. So brown and pink in the Sanborn code meant brick or concrete or essentially fireproof construction. Yellow meant wood construction, not fireproof. So you can see that these materials would make a big difference in fire insurance rates. Wooden buildings burn down all the time. Concrete and brick, not so much. The maps also called out the general sizes of buildings or their footprints, as well as the number of stories. They're a little bit hard to read in this enlargement, so I'm sorry for that. The maps also noted things like furnaces or boilers or other utilities or equipment that would generate heat and thus might start a fire. Water sources were also called out as a building with fire hoses or wells nearby or other firefighting equipment would get a break on fire insurance. So this is why this is such a great resource for researchers. So let's get oriented here. In this map, again from 1908, north is at the top of the map, and the water line of Bud's Inlet shows there in blue, kind of a convoluted blue line, which shows the shoreline. And keep in mind that this was long before the 4th Avenue Dam and Capitol Lake were created in 1951. So at this time, in fact, for decades, tidal water could still come up right up to the foot of the brewery. So this was tidelands here, essentially. Navigable only at high tide. Other than that, it emptied out and was essentially salt marsh. So the red star on the left is today's brew house tower, the one that we can see and has been in the news so often for the last few years. That was built in 1905 and became operational in 1906. The red star on the right is the original wooden brew house, which was built in 1896. So after the brick brew house was built, the old brew house was converted to be used as a beer cellar where they would age beer. This red star shows the Keg House, which was also known as the cooperage building, where barrels and kegs were made on site and stored. This building was built in 1907. This star now shows a long building about 30 feet by 200 feet, which was a storage shed. It was originally built on pilings and essentially was just an open wooden dock on pilings. It appeared around 1907. And later on, it was had a roof built over it. And then even later on, it was walled in so that it was an enclosed storage shed. But in the early years, it was just an open roofed structure. Around 1910, it shows up with huge "It's the Water" letters on its roof. A lot of these buildings, because they had pretty well-defined build dates and tear down dates, help us date photos. Someone can bring in a photo that we might not have seen before, but we can date it because a certain building appears or a certain building isn't there. So usually we can pin down photos to a 2 or 3 year period, even if we haven't seen it before. So these two buildings side by side were the cellar buildings. The one on the right in brown was built in 1905. The one on the left in pink was 1907. They were built of brick and concrete. So all these buildings that I showed you give us a way to follow the evolution of the site from year to year, and we'll go through those on most of the maps that come up. And don't worry if you get a little lost, because Paul and I spent years figuring this stuff out, and we still come up with mysteries once in a while. So leaving 1908, we're going to go to Prohibition, again, which end of 1915, beginning of 1916. And the Schmidts at that time were more than ready to convert the brewery to other uses. Of course, they'd known since 1914 that beer was going to be stopped being produced. So they were given a year to finish up production and sell any stored beer. The Schmidts had already decided to convert the brewery into producing fruit juice products. In fact, they'd already been experimenting with different non-alcoholic beverages for a few years. The fruit juice business didn't last for very long, and it went through some mergers and name changes. The Schmidt started with a company called the Olympia Beverage Company. It produced Lact, which was a non-alcoholic cereal beverage, Fruju, made from Pacific Coast fruits, Fruit Pop, which is a flavored soda water, and Tumwater, which was just the natural artesian water from the on-site wells with some carbonation added. Oldie Beverage also made German Brew, which was a near beer, and I'm going to ask Paul to explain what near beer was.
Near beer was a fermented product using brewer's yeast, but produced very little alcohol. And they could go two ways with that. The definition of near beer is a beverage containing less than 0.5% alcohol. That's less than 0.5%. It can be produced through fermenting grains, as beer would be, but they limit the fermentation in various ways. And then they could produce it with higher alcohol, but it would have to be removed by distillation. And it's not clear to us at this point which method they used to control the alcohol to a point less than 0.5%. Anyway, quite a few breweries were producing a near beer at that time, just biding their time until the Prohibition would be over and they could get back to business.
Okay. The Olympia Beverage Company didn't last for too long because it shortly merged with the Northwest Fruit Products Company, which was headquartered at another Schmidt brewery in Salem, Oregon. That plant had already been converted to making loganberry juice. And in the next couple of years, the company went through some name changes, ending with the Fez Company. There was also a short-lived dairy products company on site run by the Schmidts, but within a year or two, that business moved back into Olympia. But the main product and the most successful product during the fruit juice years was apple juice. This came in a few variations, but was essentially an unfermented apple juice, or apple cider, if you will. One version had carbonation added to it to make it fizz. I think it was called the champagne of apple juices. A few of the brewery buildings were used for, or they were converted for pressing the apples, and some new machinery was brought in for grinding and pressing. But the existing beer vessels and tanks were all easily used for making apple juice. So it was a fairly straightforward conversion. Here you can see workers offloading apples that came in by freight cars. And they were offloaded into a trough filled with water, and that carried them up into the plant where they were pressed into juice. So what did the site look like during the fruit juice years? Well, here's another Sanborn map showing the site as it looked in 1924. Now, this is slightly after the fruit juice years, but the buildings had not changed much from, say, 1916 to 1924. This is just the next time that Sanborn visited the area to make new maps, which they didn't do every year. So north is still at the top of the map, and the shoreline hasn't changed very much. Here's the brew house tower again. And a couple of new buildings have popped up since the previous map was made in 1908. Just below the star was a building that gave Paul and me fits for a long time. In fact, we called it the Mystery Building because we had no idea what it was. It showed up in 1909, and it was a substantial building. It was wooden, but it was 1 story tall with a 2-story addition on it. And I actually don't remember exactly how we reached that eureka moment where we figured out what it was really used for, but Paul can tell you a little bit more about that.
You were talking about the Mystery Building?
The Mystery Building, yeah.
Yeah, the Mystery Building started appearing in photos we were looking at, and we had no idea what it was all about. But it turns out that it was built probably about 1909, and it was for handling handling processing the spent grains. Originally, the spent grains were discharged in the north side of the brew house building. And it was very near the point where grains were unloaded from rail cars on the same track. I can imagine that when the production of beer became so intense that they were having conflicts with unloading spent grain or loading out spent grain and unloading grain for brewing, that they were having a lot of problems figuring out which they had to do first, because they're in same general location. Also, about that time, I believe the company wanted to expand the use of spent grain into some byproducts that probably maybe Karen will discuss later. But anyway, this additional building was built, and the spent grain holding tank was moved into that building, and that allowed more space for unloading grain, and they didn't have the conflict anymore with the spent grain going out. I'm not sure about what all the byproducts was that they produced from spent grain in that building. Basically, spent grain went out for cattle feed, though.
Okay, right above that red star is a building that's labeled here as a Stave Shed. We don't know what that was, so that requires some more research. We have some guesses, but because they're just guesses, I'm not even going to go into that. But we'll be looking into that. Maybe we can find out what that building was used for. So here at this red star was a building that the brewery, when the brewery was operational, it was used to store brewing materials. It also was a woodworking area and served as a locker room for employees. But during the fruit juice years, it was where the area was used to press apples. So all the buildings that's shown in yellow are wood, and all those are eventually going to go away. So why did the beverage business itself fade away? A couple of reasons. First, the near beer, or the German brew that the Spitz made, did okay for a while at the onset of Prohibition. People obviously wanted to drink something that was tasted close to beer, but near beer lost most of its market share when bootlegging became popular and when people realized they could make homemade booze or bathtub gin. And the second reason the beverage business, at least here, faded away was because of the sugar shortage during World War I. The US government imposed rationing on some different foods, reserving much of the country's supply of these foods for the troops overseas. And eventually soft drinks were declared to be a non-essential food product. So the beverage industry couldn't get sugar to make sweetened drinks. And what sugar was left for stateside businesses and consumers went up in price. The other side of this coin was a self-fulfilling prophecy of sorts. After sugar rationing was instituted, rumors began about a severe sugar shortage. The grocery stores and government officials reassured the public that there is no sugar shortage, it's just that we're holding most of it out for our troops, but don't get alarmed. Well, you know how the public is. We got alarmed anyway and started hoarding sugar, thereby creating a real shortage. Now, doesn't this sound familiar? Remember 2 years ago when you couldn't find a roll of toilet paper on the store shelves? Same thing was happening here. People got upset, they were worried, they wanted toilet paper, so they hoarded it and started panic buying, and so there was a quote unquote shortage. So history repeats itself. But at any rate, in the early 1920s, the Schmitz gave up the beverage business. They moved on with other ventures, such as managing and owning hotels, which were called Western Hotel Chain, later became West End Hotels, which still exist today. By the time the beverage industry here was dying, the business was owned by the Fez Company. And in 1922, the Fez Company sold the property to West Coast Pulp and Paper Company, which, with one name change, operated the site until around 1930. Back in 1977, the city of Tumwater wanted to put its historic district on the National Register of Historic Places. So a nomination paper was written about the history of the entire site, not just the brewery, but the brewery was a main component in this proposed historic district. The nomination paper said that the Tumwater Paper Company purchased the brewery site in 1927. Well, that's not true. The Tumwater Paper Company, which was, the true name was Tumwater Paper Mills, didn't even exist until 1926. West Coast Pulp and Paper was the company that bought the site in 1922. So paper mills were a big deal on the West Coast in the 1920s. In 1922, West Coast Pulp and Paper, which was organized by some Oregon men, bought the brewery site with the goal of converting it to paper production. But they ended up sitting on it for a few years. I don't really know why, but the site just sat idle. And they did put out a prospectus, though, attempting to sell stock. And in 1926, they were finally ready to start rehabbing the site, and the company name was changed to Tumwater Paper Mills, and even the Olympia Brewing Company eventually bought some shares. Now I'm going to try to dispel a myth here. A historic structures report, which was prepared in 2011, just a few years ago here, said that the existing long building, marked here with a red star, was built in 1945 for a metal manufacturer. But that's not true. This long building was actually built in 1927 for the paper mill. I apologize for the awful photo here, but it's from a 1927 newspaper and just didn't enlarge well. But the Associated News story was about the paper mill starting to put in new buildings on site. You can see the brew house tower in the right background, and in the left background, you can see the cellar buildings. And on the left side foreground, and right along the left side of the photograph, is part of the foundation for the new machine room built for the paper mill. And in this air photo, also from 1927, you can see the long manufacturing building with all the windows, and it's built again for the paper mill. So this building, which still exists, was built in 1927. So what was on the site in the paper mill years? This map is from a 1944 brochure, but shows what was there in 1927 through 1930, because the site didn't change much after that. The building names that you see were the ones that were used by the paper mill. Again, the star on the left marks the brew house tower, which was used as a digester building by the paper mill. I'll explain that in a minute. Immediately to the right of the tower, or the right of the left-hand star, is a squarish building, which was built as a boiler house for the paper mill. That boiler house still exists. And just above the boiler house is a large grind and wood room used to start the process of turning wood into paper. That building was used only by the paper mill and was torn down by the next occupant. The star on the right, the far right, identifies the covered dock and storage shed, which we talked about. So here, the star on the left marks the cellar buildings, which were converted into a bleach room and a beater and wet room for paper making. The star on the right marks the paper mill's finishing room. That building made kind of an elbow into the south end of the old Keg House. Later survey documents misidentify the finishing room as being built in 1945, but it was actually built in 1927. The spaces shown in blue here in the center of the complex are empty, but they're going to be occupied by one-story infill buildings in 1945, and we'll get to that later on. So I thought you might be interested in a very brief overview of the paper making process. And don't ask me any questions about this because I don't understand it very well. I just catch this from the website, but we can see the buildings numbered here. So the wood was brought onto site, probably by rail. It was offloaded into building number 1, which was the grind and wood room, and it was chopped up into little pieces. Then those little pieces were transferred over into building number 2, which was the brew house tower. There was a large tank called the digester there, and the wood chips were put in the tank, chemicals were added, and the whole thing was cooked until it became a pulp. Then the pulp was transferred over to building number 3, which was the old cellar building, and bleach was added to create a light or even a white material. So that's why that was called the bleach room. Then everything was shunted over to number 4 building, Water was added to create a slurry, and then it was cleaned and filtered and screened. And then you pretty much had raw paper because everything was clean at that point. And so it went on to number 5, the machine room, which contained a very large paper making machine. That slurry was put into the machine, which compressed and started to dry the material and pressed and pressed and pressed until you had flat sheets of paper. The paper then was transferred over to the finishing room at number 6, where it was dried even more and then cut and prepared to create actual paper. And then it was shipped off to number 7, which was a warehouse where it was packaged and awaited shipping out again by rail. So you can see that the old brewery buildings, which are at number 2, 3, 4, and 7, were well suited and well placed to create or to handle the paper making process with the additions of building 1, 5, and 6. So everything moved through the site in a nice counterclockwise circular process. And the buildings actually worked out very well for the whole paper mill business. Now here's some from that big machine room, which was hundreds of feet long. Here's some photos from around 1944 or so, which showed the building empty at that time, of course. But you can imagine this was at one time filled with different machines and paper making material. And then here's the upper floor of that same building, which had more paper making machines in it. So what brought the paper mill to an end? In short, the Depression. The paper mill actually started production in late 1927 after a lot of hype and building delays. It then closed down over Christmas and New Year's of 1927 to make some changes for using a different kind of fuel. In February 28, the mill was shut down for a week or so to install a new slicing machine. And then in May of 29, which is the next time it has any significant news article in the local newspaper, the mill was resuming operations after a 10-month shutdown. So to me, that means the mill didn't operate very steadily or for very long. No reason for the shutdown was given. But about the same time, controlling interest in the paper mill was obtained by a man who owned other mills in the West Coast. He reorganized and refinanced the company, so maybe the mill's original owners weren't doing too well. News items said the new owner, quote, planned to operate the mill continuously, assuring a permanent payroll and materially increasing the commercial shipments from the port. So I don't have any more info about why the mill shut down, but it apparently had a real on again, off again history of operation. And then, of course, what happened in September of 1929? The stock market crash. By January 3rd of 1930, the mill was closed for repairs, ostensibly, but by March, the secretary treasurer of the company had left for greener pastures. The mill tried to raise money to reopen because in July 1930, the Olympia Brewery actually bought 10 shares of stock, even though the mill wasn't operational. However, I doubt the mill ever reopened. An event like that would have been big news and would have made the papers, but there was nothing in the local papers until 1934, when a couple of legislators tried to place the mill in receivership. And in late 1939, the banks finally foreclosed on the mill's mortgage. So essentially from 1930 to 1945, the paper mill sat vacant. At any rate, the site now was posed to enter the metalcraft era. First, the Olympia Brewery briefly required the site. After the banks foreclosed on the paper mill site, I'm guessing that a successor company called North Pacific Paper Mills controlled the site for a while. The history is a little fuzzy, so I won't go into that. But at any rate, the brewery did buy the entire old brewery site in 1945, but with the purpose of obtaining the water rights, 2 artesian wells on the property, and certain easements for utilities. The brewery quickly resold the bulk of the site, minus the water-related items, to the Jensvold Manufacturing Company. Jensvold brought a metalware factory to the site, and although that company segued into other names, metalware was made on the site until 1962. So now we get to blow out another myth. The Historic Register nomination form, which was written in 1977, says that the buildings were purchased by Jensvold Manufacturing Company, a firm involved in the production of parts for the Boeing Company. There was an historic structures report written in 2011 that said the site was used as a manufacturing plant for the Jensvold Manufacturing Company, which produced airplane parts for Boeing. And at least one other publication, a photo book on Tumwater history, continues the myth that Boeing airplane parts were made at the brewery site. Wrong. Let me say again, wrong. We'll go through that. But in order to dispel that myth, we have to do a bit of backtracking into the history of B.B. Jensvold and Boeing. So a guy named Basil B. Jensvold, which was shown at the lower left, grew up in North Dakota and moved to Olympia in the late 1930s. He established a general contractor business in town and then started a metal manufacturing business called, oddly enough, B.B. Jensvold Company. And where was it located? In the old Olympia Knitting Mills building at 524 South Jefferson, which is currently the home of Fish Brewing. And you can see that there in the photo on the upper right. His business was fairly small and it initially employed just 3 men. So that's how Jensvold got his start. At the beginning of World War II, Boeing, located in Seattle, got huge contracts to build B-17 planes for the military. The company soon ran into manpower problems, though, because it had maxed out all the workforce available in Seattle. It just couldn't hire enough people. So it came up with the plan to build several branch plants around Western Washington in places that had a sizable workforce ready to go to work for Boeing. Many different towns in Western Washington wanted to get a Boeing branch plant in their town. Olympia tried to get one, and the Chamber of Commerce had searched for a site with existing buildings that could be converted into a Boeing branch plant. And the Olympia Chamber of Commerce came up with a few possibilities, but they were all shot down by Boeing engineers who felt that they would take too much time and money to retrofit. Boeing wanted to spin up the branch plants pretty fast and wanted sites that could be quickly converted for their use. So Boeing eventually located branch plants in places like Aberdeen, Everett, Bellingham, Tacoma, Chehalis, and a few other locations, but not Olympia or Tumwater. However, a lot of subcontracts were given to smaller existing manufacturers. The B.B. Jensvold Company was found to be a good fit for making some metal parts. So in 1943, Jensvold got a subcontract for making tools, lockers, desks, and some other metal items for the Navy. For military planes, the company also made cargo platforms, tail ribs, and connecting tunnels, which were passageways between the main fuselage of the plane and the gun control area. At least one source says Jensvold Plant Olympia also made wing assembly parts. But at any rate, all of this work was done at the plant on Jefferson Street in Olympia, where at the peak of production, 500 people were employed and 350 of those were women. So this was definitely a Rosie the Riveter type plant. In August of 1945, getting towards the end of World War II, the brewery had already purchased the old brewery site to get the water rights that we just talked about. And B.B. Jensvold incorporated a new business called the Jensvold Manufacturing Company for, as he called it, peacetime manufacturing of metal goods. The board of directors even included Peter G. Schmidt and Fred Schmidt. So the brewery sold the site to Jensvold Manufacturing Company for $30,000 in cash and $30,000 in stock. This all happened just right when the war was coming to an end. On September 2nd, 1945, what happened? Japan surrendered and World War II was at an end. Boeing issued a stop work order to Jensvold on September 5th, and all production work for Boeing and planes and whatnot, any military contracts came to an end then. At that time, 200 employees were working at the plant on Jefferson Street. Only a few were laid off, and the rest immediately started making metal furniture and cooking utensils. So peacetime products. But that was under the name of B.B. Jensvold Company. The new company, Jensvold Manufacturing, still owned by BB Jensvold, started cleaning up and revamping the buildings at the old brewery site. So this preliminary work wasn't finished until the spring of 1946, when production of metal items, peacetime metal items, started at the old brewery. So you can see that since Boeing contracts were terminated in September of 1945, and manufacturing at the old brewery site didn't start until the spring of 1946, airplane parts were never made at the old brewery site. They were made exclusively at the Jefferson plant in downtown Olympia. And the Boeing work was done by contract through BB Jensvold Company, while Jensvold Manufacturing Company, same guy running them, but different companies altogether, never did any Boeing work. So I hope that dispels the myth that Boeing parts were made at the old brewery. Would have been cool if it was true, but unfortunately not. So back to our main theme here. What did the buildings look like at that time? So during the middleware era, here's a good aerial photo of the plant from around 1947, 1948. The brochure that we have here in our archives was not dated. So the red star, again, marks the old brew house tower, which was used as a digester plant for the paper mill and now becomes used for other purposes, manufacturing purposes, by Jensvold. Here the star shows the long machine building put up by the paper mill in 1927. What Jensvold did to the building was reinforce the basement by adding extra footings and beams to support the metal pressing machines upstairs. The design for the rebuild was done by famed local architect Joseph Wolub. Some sources say that Wolub designed the whole building in 1945, but no, he designed the retrofit. The building itself was built in 1927. Another building that Wolub revamped was the building that had started out in 1907 as a cellar for the brewery. You can see the red star in the far right here. And it was converted to a bleach room for the paper mill. The architectural sketch in the middle of the screen shows the architectural plan for the original 1907 building. You can see it was pretty plain. It was done in brick and only had a few windows. By the time the metal manufacturer and Wolub were working on it, they wanted it converted into offices and locker rooms and restrooms and a lunchroom. And so the west end of the building, as you can see on the left, was rebuilt. The inside of the building obviously was rebuilt too, but the shell remained the same except for the west end, which was done in a totally different architectural style, done in concrete. So again, the building was originally built in 1907 and was just remodeled by Wolub in 1945. So now the red star shows the old Keg House, originally built in 1907 and used as a warehouse by the paper mill. What disappeared from the site by this time? On the far left, you can see dashed red outline, which marks where the dock and storage shed, 30 by 200 foot building, stood, but it's gone now. Actually, I think you can still see a bit of the dock remaining, but the upper structure itself is gone. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you see a dashed outline, which shows where the paper mill's wood grinding building had been. So by this time, the 1946-47, all the old wooden brewery buildings had been removed. What was left was all brick or concrete. So if Jensvold and his successors weren't making Boeing airplane parts, what were they doing? Well, they were primarily making metal kitchen and bathroom cabinets. My office in the Schmidt House basement has a set of those cabinets, and I bet there are still a lot of them in various homes in the area. The company had been making steel cabinets, but in 1947 started migrating to aluminum. And in fact, by late 1947, Western Metalcraft had emerged as the largest producer of aluminum cabinets in the United States, according to their sales material. They even had big contracts with places like Hot Pike and Sears Roebuck. But the move to aluminum away from steel proved to be their downfall, as we'll find it in a bit. The plant also made something called Lug Boxes, which was an all-purpose stacking box designed and patented by Frederick Schmidt. And we have a lug box in our collection, thanks to Paul Knight, who picked one up at a garage sale, did you?
My wife Emmy did.
Oh, okay, so his wife Emmy found a lug box in the garage sale. I think they had several of them, and Paul donated one to our collection. By 1947, Jensvold himself, B.B. Jensvold, was asked to step down as general manager by the board. A business report said, everyone realizes that Jensvold is very capable in mechanical fields of work, but has not the requisite managerial or business experience or ability to successfully manage the business. Ouch. So he left, although he retained stock in the company, and the company was reorganized as Western Metalcraft, and Frederick Schmidt took over organizing or took over managing the firm. So here's another plan view of the buildings during the metal era. Again, here on the plan, we have shown in kind of a purple hue. On the left is the brew house tower. To its right, noted as shipping and packing, is the old two-story boiler room. And on the far right is now used as metal cutting and storage, but is the old Keg House from 1907. The big two-story machine building, which was built for the paper mill, is now used as painting and assembling and manufacturing by the metal company. The gray areas in the middle are one-story infill buildings, which were fairly cheaply built and weren't used for long, and they disappear after a time here, but we'll get to that. So, oh, in fact, let me, if I can back up here, forgot to mention that the gray infill building on the left is called Colatrim Company, and it was a separate building, but was connected with the metal manufacturing, and they made extruded aluminum pieces like if you've seen metal legs on awnings, that's one of the products they made. So here's a series of photos from around 1946. Here's the brew house tower again. Here's the star on the right, shows the old boiler house from the paper mill era, and it's now used for shipping and packing. And it has below it in a lighter hue, it has a one-story addition and an infill building for manufacturing metal trim. The star on the left shows where another infill building was used for manufacturing. So here, where this star is, you can see the old cellar buildings. And here's some shot of the big metal manufacturing room, the old paper mill building. And on the view in the right, you can see an odd looking structure. It was actually an oven used to bake, a traveling oven where finished cabinets were painted and then went on a little trolley system through this U-shaped oven so the paint was baked on. Here in this view, you can see men building cabinet structures. And then on the second floor of that big building, they were, again, pressing metal into different shapes and building metal desks and whatnot. And here's a view of the metal trim manufacturing building, and actually had women working there too. So by 1952, Western Metalcraft was having financial difficulties. Most of this was due to the fact that Western had segued from using steel to using aluminum, just in time for the Korean War to hit. In World War II, the government was interested in using steel for military manufacturing, like planes and whatnot. But at the time the Korean War, early 1950s, the government decided that they would use aluminum. So the metal manufacturer had segued to aluminum at the wrong time. They had lots of contracts for building metal cabinets, but they couldn't get the raw material, aluminum, to build them from. So they were kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. They eventually sold the company to an Oregon firm who reorganized and renamed the company as General Metalcraft. So this company puttered along making cabinets and shower stalls and other things, but in 1961, they decided to close the Tumwater plant and move operations to a new plant in California. By July 1962, production in Tumwater had ceased and the industrial equipment was auctioned off. Oops, I missed a slide here. So after the auction, the company tried to auction off the real estate too, but they just managed to auction off all the equipment. So from 1962 to 1964, the brewery was vacant. In 1964, the Olympia Brewery bought back the old site in order to use it as a warehouse. And Paul, can you tell us because you were actually working here then, can you tell us what kind of equipment and other things were stored at the warehouse?
There was a multitude of items stored at the warehouse, including used brewery equipment that was no longer needed, had been replaced by more modern equipment. So waiting disposition, it would be stored in the warehouse. And it was inside the brewery, we called it the North Warehouse. I was working there at the time and in the brewing department, and we stored brewing materials. And there was a large section on the east side of the lower floor that we converted into what we called a white room. And we had to have it approved by the FDA, Federal Drug Administration, for storage of brewing materials. So it was sparkling clean and painted white and maintained at a high level for storing brewing materials. But the brewing department was not the only department that used the old brew house buildings for storage. The bottling used it, and so did the engineering department, the maintenance people. There was a lot of traffic up and down this one-lane road, more or less, from North Street, or Custerway, I should say, down to the old warehouse. There's some passing lanes where two vehicles met, one would pull off into the passing lane while the other one went by. But it was used very much for many years and until the brewery closed by Miller Brewing Company in 2003.
Okay, so in 2004, the old site was purchased by the All American Bottled Water Company, and they didn't last there for too long. They abandoned the property. And the site was then purchased by George Heidgerken, who did business under a few different names, most notably Falls Development. Falls Development, minus George Heidgerken, who has since left, still owns the bulk of the site. But in 2016, Falls Development transferred the brew house tower itself and a 12-foot strip of land around it to the city of Tumwater. So here's an aerial view of what the site looks like today, well, or a few years ago, because this photo was taken before the restoration work on the brew house started. Again, the red star marks the brew house tower itself. The star on the left marks the 1905 and 1907 Cellar Buildings. The star on the right is the original 1907 Keg House. And the star on the top is the 1927 Boiler House, which was built by the paper mill. The star on the bottom is the Long Building, which served as the machine room for the paper mill in the late 1920s, as an assembly room for metal manufacturing in the 40s through the early 60s, and was finally used as storage space when ownership returned to the brewery. So where does the brewery site go from here? The city of Tumwater and the Friends of the Brew House nonprofit group and other folks have already done a lot of rehab work on the brew house. They've replaced roofs, they've cleaned up the interior, they boarded up the windows temporarily to provide security. They replaced and repaired most of the brickwork. They've done a lot of work, but there's a lot of work to do. The next step after the city raises money to do it is to provide seismic stability for the whole structure. And after that, the city has to work hand in hand with Falls Development to come up with a creative use plan for the entire site. So that's our program, and I think we have time for a few questions. And Don, I'm going to stop sharing screen and turn
Okay.
it back to you.
All right, good. Well, yes, let's go ahead and ask any questions. Anybody interested in making a comment or question there? I haven't heard from Pete. Did you have anything to add, Mayor Pete?
No, I think Karen's covered it well, but I do have a question.
Good.
So the Cooperage building, I think it was building number 7 on one of those maps,
Mhm.
has a concrete platform in the upstairs area. Do you have any idea what that was used for?
There was a rail siding that went past the building that was used for loading and unloading kegs and so forth.
No, I mean on the interior of the building, it's like this huge block of concrete kind of in the middle of the floor. It takes up a lot of space.
That was a raised area to give headroom down for the floor below for the pitching area where they repitch the kegs.
Okay,
Yeah, there was a huge ductwork that went down near the floor. If you remember, you've been in there with me, Pete, that on the floor below, there's this wall that skirts down to within a few feet of the floor. So that there was a big ductwork that fit in that area and extended into that raised area you're talking about on the floor above. So it was to benefit the pitching of the kegs.
great. Thank you.
All right, good. Right. Well, we're just about to the end of the time slot here. Any more questions, you can sure contact Karen here at the Schmidt House Curator office. Do you want to give out your phone number, Karen? Or?
Sure. 360-890-2299. Or my email address is karen@olytumfoundation.org.
All right, thank you very much. And let's see, well, next month, noon Wednesday is April 13th. It'll be Tenino historian Rich Edwards. He'll be talking about his book, The Naming of Tenino. So you might want to sign up for that with City Parks and Recreation. And then Wednesday, May 11th, we have online here author and former director of the Washington State Historical Society, David Nicandri, with his book, Captain Cook Rediscovered: Voyage to the Icy Latitudes. So those are the two that we have lined up. We will have monthly meetings after that, but I don't have anybody in the slots yet quite. We do have a return of the Riverwalk tours along the park. And the first one of those will be at 5 p.m. on Monday, April 18th down at the park. If you would like to join up, also you need to sign up through the City Parks and Recreation, just like you did for these talks. And there's a limited number, but we'll finally get back to some live events, and that's going to be very welcome to me. So anyway, thank you so much. I did, here's the book. Let's see, can you see it? There we go. The Naming of Tenino. That's the one that we'll be doing next talk. So thank you again so much. Thanks to Karen and Paul and Mayor Pete and everybody that showed up. We ended up with 17 people signing in and watching the program. And so we just thank you for your participation and your encouragement, and keep it up. All right. Thank you very much. We'll sign off. All right.